What? 5 kilometers of mudflats? That's an awful lot. Are they sure about when, how, and where they can, actually send in the invasion force? I mean, won't the ships have to pull back to avoid getting stuck? That's the plan. But they'll be leaving these guys on an island alone. Okay. Uh-huh. All right. September 10th, 1950. You have an invasion plan and you're pretty happy with it. Thing is, your guys have never really reconnoitered the area to be invaded. And since it's an amphibious invasion, there are lots of details about the local waters you really want to know. What do? You send in a guy. A guy. I'm Indy Neidell, and this is the Korean War. Last week, the North Korean forces launched a huge new offensive all around the Pusan perimeter, the little corner of Korea into which the UN forces have been pushed. And in just a couple of days, have a couple of U.S. divisions in real trouble. That huge general offensive now continues, but this week, there are counteroffensives against it. At 8 a.m. on the 4th of September, the day dawning clear and warm after a night of chilling rain, 2nd Battalion 9th Infantry, on line with the 5th Marines, jumped off, beginning the counterattack against the Bulge. During the rainy night, the enemy had been oddly passive, and now, during the day, the advancing Americans began to come upon scenes of indescribable confusion and horror. Bodies of North Koreans, victims of American air and artillery, lay scattered all about along the roads, unburied. The advancing Americans passed abandoned equipment, including 2 undamaged T-34s. They came upon tents still standing, apparently the former command post of the enemy 9th Division. Now it seemed that the men of the Incheon, asked to go to the well once too often, were beginning to break apart. The Incheon is the KPA, the North Korean army. The Marines advance about 5 kilometers before they dig in for the night. On the 5th, they and the 9th Infantry fight their way back to Obongni Ridge, or No Name Ridge, which they and we have seen several times. And they halt their counteroffensive here. They can see the KPA 9th Division digging in. And it's fairly obvious it doesn't have any real combat power any longer. KPA 4th Division is in support, but they haven't been combat worthy for some time now. So why do the Marines not press the attack? Well, Douglas MacArthur has other plans for the Marines, which I'll get to in a few minutes, and he's been waiting for them to be released from the front here for those plans. They are released on the 6th and head for Pusan, leaving just the U.S. 9th Regiment to face the KPA 9th Division. The NKPA had made a dramatic breakthrough in the Bulge on the 1st of September, but now it had revealed what was to be a continuing weakness of the communist armies in Asia. They could break through the UN lines, but they could not exploit their local successes. With poor communications and even poorer systems of supply, dependent solely upon manpower to move their resupply, the enemy could not move quickly enough to exploit, particularly in the teeth of superior air power, armor, and artillery. To put it simply, faced with breakthrough, the UN forces could retreat and counterattack faster than the Incheon could press their advantage. Whenever the heavier armed United States Army could form continuous battle lines and withhold a reserve, the communist tactics were doomed to failure. In the fighting north of the Naktong Bulge, KPA 2nd Division has separated the 23rd Infantry from U.S. 2nd Division. Remember, the U.S. 2nd Division was split in half last week, with the 9th Regiment to the south and the 23rd and 38th to the north. Well, 38th gets in gear to help take some pressure off of 23rd from the north. And what is a very serious enemy threat is slowly contained. By the 9th, 23rd Regiment is down to 38% efficiency, but the North Korean 2nd Division is a broken force. T.R. Fehrenbach writes that a great mystery of the war happens during this, or fails to happen. See, this week, the North Korean 10th Division, which has over 7,000 men, is in a position to attack the 23rd Regiment or to head east towards Daegu. That full division, throwing its weight into the fight, could have made the difference and really ripped a hole in 8th Army, but for whatever reason, 10th Division does not advance. Last week, I said that disaster threatened in U.S. 25th Division zone to the south, but did not expound much on that. They have been hit hard since August 31st. The 35th Infantry Regiment faces both the KPA 6th and 7th Divisions, or elements thereof, and even with 3 and possibly more enemy battalions in their rear, they still hold out the rest of last week and this week. But south of them, the 24th Infantry breaks. And not for the first time, and the KPA pushes through towards Haman. But John Michaela's 27th Regiment, Henry Fisher's 35th, and the 5th Regimental Combat Team, currently attached, managed to quash the enemy threat the first few days of this week. On the East Coast, things looked really bad for the ROK, that's the South Korean forces, as last week ended. But American air power and armored support, and the mountains, again, slowly tipped the battle in favor of the UN forces. Sure, there are several local KPA breakthroughs, but overall, the enemy cannot breach the perimeter in force. I mentioned Daegu a little while ago, and it is there that U.S. 1st Cavalry Division has a front of 35 kilometers. And while by the 5th, it seems that the pressure on most of the whole perimeter is diminishing, it is not here. Here, it is only getting worse. In fact, U.S. 8th Army moves its headquarters and signals equipment, which is irreplaceable, away and down to Pusan together with the ROKs, though 8th Army Commander Walton Walker remains in Daegu. By the 8th, though, the KPA 1st and 8th Divisions are just 24 kilometers from the city, and the Cavalry Division has both a manpower and an ammunition shortage. Still, by September 10th, the perimeter began to settle down once again. On its western face, the Americans had taken back all the North Koreans had gained, and a little more. General Walker could now look forward with some confidence, not simply to maintaining his position, but to an actual counteroffensive. Even better than that, the United Nations Command was on the verge of springing one of the great strategical surprises of the century. About that, the U.S. Joint Chiefs of Staff and U.S. President Harry Truman give their final green light for Operation Chromite this week. This is the proposed amphibious invasion of the port of Incheon, far behind enemy lines. On the 6th, MacArthur issues final orders for the attack to go off the 15th. Thing is, Walker's army is supposed to break out from the Pusan perimeter just after the Incheon operation goes off. But the strength of this North Korean offensive does have many skeptical that he could actually do this. On the 8th, MacArthur writes to Washington that there is no possibility of Walker's force being actually pushed off the Pusan beachhead. And it doesn't really matter if he successfully drives north or not. Naval and aerial supremacy mean that the northern and southern forces are self-sufficient. And the northern one taking the Seoul area will wreck logistics so badly for the KPA that it will disintegrate. That's the primary purpose of the operation. And the KPA caught between the forces will be destroyed. The Joint Chiefs write tersely back, "We approve your plan, and the President has been so informed." I've talked a lot about the plans for Incheon and the difficulties involved, including just getting permission to launch such an operation. The biggest issue of all, though, might well have been just finding the troops to do the job. For a while there, every time the planning group designated a unit to join the invasion force, it was taken away because of what was unfolding on the ground in Korea. The force to attack is 10th Corps under Edward Ullman, made up of the U.S. 7th Infantry and 1st Marine Divisions. 7th has been repeatedly stripped of units, and when they got the order to prepare for Incheon, they were 9,000 men below full strength. Well, they have attempted to address that just lately. For a number of days of August and September, despite the 8th Army's shrieks of dismay, the entire infantry and artillery replacement pipeline was channeled into the 7th Division. And at MacArthur's orders, Walker shipped 8,000 Koreans over from Pusan as Katusa, Korean augmentation personnel, for these divisions. These unfortunates were all civilians, swept up from the streets and refugee camps of Pusan. They poured ashore in Japan, bewildered, scared, and sick. Many wore only sandals and shorts. Understanding no English, they were herded to American companies and batteries in packets of 100 where they were regarded with no high enthusiasm by American commanders. Producing a Marine division involved even bringing guys from the Mediterranean Sea over. As for the Marine Brigade we've seen fighting in the Pusan perimeter, they're only released in the nick of time to take part in this. They've seen a ton of battle lately, but getting them released from 8th Army is not without frustration. Walton Walker even angrily snaps, "I will not be responsible for the safety of 8th Army's front if I lose the 5th Marine Regiment." But released this week, they are. The Navy, though, is prepared to do its part. There's around 230 UN ships for the whole operation. Joint Task Force 7 is under 7th Fleet Commander Arthur Strubel's overall command. They're not doing just transport and logistics, but also aerial support, minesweeping and blockading, and bombarding the shore. Still not going to be easy. Aside from all the problems I've already gone over the past weeks, the port of Incheon is really in two pieces. There's the outer harbor, and then the island of Wolmi-do, which creates the inner harbor and is connected by a causeway to the mainland. Wolmi-do is like 1 kilometer off the mainland, and will have to be taken first to prevent flanking fire from wrecking the invasion force. But to do that, it will first have to be bombarded, as will Incheon itself, but because of the tidal timing, and the massive difference between low and high tide here, which creates like 5 kilometers of mud flats, Wolmi-do will have to be taken at 1 high tide, and then they'll have to wait for the next to hit Incheon. A pre-invasion bombardment was going to foil the element of surprise, and then the troops taking and holding Wolmi-do were going to be isolated for at least 12 hours before the next phase of the landing could be carried out. No one planning an operation would do it this way by choice, and the only thing to recommend it was that there was no other way to go about it. The plan is for the Marines to hit Wolmi-do 5 days from today at 6:30 a.m., and then hit Incheon during the afternoon tide 11 hours later. The Navy is currently recording tidal and current information and has been for over a week. Well, I say the Navy, but it's Eugene Clark. He and 2 former ROK officers began exploring the Incheon area back on the 1st. The island of Yonghong-do was occupied by exactly 5 KPA troops, so some of Clark's guys captured it. They took 24 communist sympathizers prisoner and set up an island defense guard of 114 local young men. Clark also takes Palmi-do and the lighthouse there and sets about gathering intel on the North Korean navigational lights, and where and if the east or flying fish channels are mined, and are they protected by heavy artillery? This is a pretty impressive achievement. The U.S. did not, during the 3 years of occupation of Korea, investigate or record its geography. So he's figuring out the nuts and bolts of the tidal mudflats and all this other stuff, and doing it right under the enemy's noses. Well, Marine planes begin the preliminary bombardment of Wolmi-do today, the 10th, as the week ends. There are more troops who've recently arrived or are soon to arrive in Pusan to beef up the UN forces in the perimeter. This week, the British 27 Brigade takes over its part of the lines. The battalion commanders were uneasy at the huge gaps between their rifle companies, barely covered even by the long-range fire of their Vickers medium machine guns. To make matters worse, the Middlesex, on the right flank of the brigade, found that their immediate neighbors were a 200-man unit of the ROK National Police, who were untrained, poorly disciplined, and only partly armed. Major Rolly Wynn of the Middlesex found himself with the job of countering the infiltration of the brigade's positions by North Koreans disguised as refugees. Life was complicated by the infuriating presence of hordes of uninvited visitors from the world press and minor officials of the United Nations, all of whom had to be entertained and fed. This brigade will soon enough be known as the 27 British Commonwealth Brigade, as an Australian contingent will arrive late in the month. And on the 7th, the Philippine government approves the Philippine Military Aid to the UN Act to allow sending a force to South Korea. President Elpidio Quirino says the Philippines are sending the Philippine Expeditionary Force to Korea, PEFTOC, in fulfillment of the country's obligation as a co-signer of the United Nations Charter. The first troops should arrive in a couple of weeks. And with that news, this week of the Korean War is over. A week with the continuing North Korean offensive all around the Pusan perimeter, which is contained pretty much everywhere except perhaps for near Daegu, which would be a major prize. All the moving pieces for Operation Chromite are doing their various tasks. And 5 days from now, the UN forces will invade Incheon, hopefully for them by surprise. Is surprise actually being maintained, though? Well, not outside of Korea, at any rate. Normally, in an amphibious landing, the element of surprise is crucial, but strangely in this case it seemed to be missing. Everyone in Tokyo appeared to know what was coming and where and when it was going to take place. In the Tokyo Press Club, a great center of rumors about the war, it was already labeled Operation Common Knowledge. North Korean leader Kim Il-sung does not seem to have picked up on the UN military buildup in Japan. But you know who has? The Chinese communists. Security in the Japanese ports is pretty minimal these days, and a lot of Japanese dock workers are hardcore communists. So the Chinese know that a lot of the stuff being brought in is stuff used for amphibious operations. Communist leader Mao Zedong, in general, has been extra concerned with Korea the past month. Kim's promised quick victory has not materialized, but Mao also sees that even as the Americans are holding on in the Pusan perimeter, they appear to be keeping 2 divisions of top troops in Japan. Why? Well, already a month ago, Mao sent Lei Ying-fu, his foreign minister Zhou Enlai's military advisor, to figure out what the Americans were up to in Japan. David Halberstam writes in The Coldest Winter, "It was the purest of military intelligence missions. Certain things were clear to the Chinese military intelligence people. In addition to some of the American units there practicing amphibious landings, Japan's harbors were swarming with American and Allied ships of all sizes from all over the world. In addition, MacArthur had waged his Pacific campaign using amphibious landings again and again. Lei studied all the available intelligence and decided the Americans were preparing a major trap for the North Koreans. They were going to land by surprise, far behind the Inmingun's lines. He believed they not only intended to break out from the Pusan perimeter, but with the amphibious landing, they hoped to capture much of the North Korean army at the same time. Lei studied his maps, tried to think like an American, and decided the amphibious assault would come at one of 6 ports, and that MacArthur, given the aggressive nature of his personality, would most likely choose Incheon. Lei gave his findings to Zhou Enlai August 23rd, and he passed them on to Mao, who told him to pass them on to Kim Il-sung. Forewarned is forearmed, so Incheon might well be a trap. But for the Americans, we shall see in a few days. Hey, if you want to see a bigger amphibious operation hitting the enemy right where it hurts, we did a 24-episode channel called D-Day 24 Hours, where each episode is 1 hour of the Operation Overlord. You can check it out here when it pops up at the end. Our Time Ghost Army member of the week is Chris Ehlers. It is the Time Ghost Army that allows us to do this and all that we do. So for ever more content, join the Time Ghost Army at timeghost.tv or patreon.com. These are the newest commissioned officers in the Army. Do not forget to subscribe. See you next week.